I never thought a pool-sharing app invite would be the thing that finally ruined my summer. But it did. Spectacularly. On a Saturday morning I will never fully forget. 200 strangers, coolers and pool floats in hand, showed up at my back gate expecting a party that had never once existed in my calendar or my imagination. My own HOA president had quietly sold every single one of them a ticket to swim in MY yard, under MY roof, without ever asking me a single question. I called the police the moment I understood what was happening. But by then the automatic gate had already sealed itself shut, trapping the entire crowd inside my fence. Chaos exploded across my backyard while I stood frozen on the porch, watching strangers press against a locked gate, children crying, adults shouting, my carefully built life unraveling in real time. 3 months earlier, none of us saw any of this coming. It was just another quiet Tuesday in a neighborhood that looked, from the outside, almost boringly perfect. By the end of that single unbelievable day, one woman's entire carefully constructed empire of control would collapse in front of the whole community she had ruled for years. And somehow, impossibly, all of it started with a $5 fine over a ceramic garden gnome my daughter had proudly planted beside our front steps 2 days after her birthday. My name is Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, a labor and delivery nurse at Mercy General, and a single mother to Emma, 10, and Jake, 7, since my divorce finalized last spring. We had moved into Willowbrook Estates 8 months earlier, a quiet cul-de-sac community just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, chosen mostly because the backyard came with a fenced pool the kids could finally use without me hovering over every splash. Willowbrook had a reputation before we even signed the closing papers, though our realtor only hinted at it, calling the HOA thorough with a knowing look I completely failed to understand at the time. That thoroughness, I would soon learn, had a specific name attached to it. Diane Kowalski, HOA president for 6 consecutive years. A retired real estate agent who treated every front lawn like a personal extension of her own authority. Diane's newsletters arrived weekly without fail, dense with grainy photographs of alleged violations. A trash can left out an hour too long, a mailbox flag angled improperly, grass grown a single inch beyond regulation height. At first I laughed the whole thing off with my neighbor Priya, who had lived there 4 years already and called Diane the sheriff, with an eye roll that told me everything I needed to know about the general tone of this place. My daughter Emma planted a small ceramic frog by our front steps, a birthday gift from her grandmother that she was fiercely proud of, and within 2 days an official citation appeared taped to our front door like an accusation. Unapproved lawn ornament, Section 4.2c. Remove within 48 hours or incur daily fines. It read, stamped with Diane's looping signature and, absurdly, a smiley face sticker that somehow made the whole thing feel more mocking than official. I removed the frog that same evening, more amused than genuinely angry, telling myself this was simply the small, silly price of a good school district and a backyard my kids already clearly loved. Diane began stopping by more frequently after that first citation, always just checking in with a bright smile, though her eyes kept drifting past me toward my pool with an interest I mistook, foolishly, for simple neighborly friendliness. She asked increasingly pointed questions about my work schedule, my rotating night shifts at the hospital, how often the kids and I actually used the pool ourselves, questions that felt oddly specific for what was supposed to be casual small talk. I did not think much of it at the time. Nurses learn to trust instinct on the job. But mine stayed strangely quiet, distracted instead by custody paperwork, mortgage payments, and the bone-deep exhaustion of doing all of this completely alone. The first real friction came over pool lighting. Diane mailed a formal notice claiming our backyard lights violated the community's supposed dark sky ordinance after 9 p.m. A rule no other house on our street appeared to be following at all. I dug through the actual HOA bylaws, a document she had apparently quietly rewritten twice without any recorded board vote, and found absolutely no such ordinance existed anywhere in the version every homeowner had signed at closing. When I raised this directly at a board meeting, Diane smiled tightly and insisted the bylaws had been recently updated for community safety, flatly refusing to produce any meeting minutes proving that vote had genuinely occurred. Priya squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that Diane had pulled something disturbingly similar on the Ramirez family 2 years earlier, right before that family suddenly, quietly sold their house and moved far away. Nobody at that particular meeting challenged her any further. Most residents simply paid whatever fine appeared in their mailbox, rather than risk fighting a woman who controlled the neighborhood Facebook group and every single social committee. I paid the fine too. $40 for lights I barely even used past 9 most nights. Mostly just to keep the peace and get back to the exhausting business of raising 2 kids on a nurse's overtime paycheck. Diane's tone noticeably softened after I paid that fine. Warmer almost, inviting me over for a welcome coffee at her house, where her own backyard displayed an enormous in-ground pool behind an immaculate glass fence. Her pool sat completely empty that afternoon, chlorine smell heavy in the humid air, and she mentioned almost wistfully that her husband Rick traveled constantly for work, leaving her, she said, with plenty of long, quiet afternoons entirely alone. I noticed a stack of glossy brochures on her kitchen counter for something called Splash Share, a peer-to-peer app connecting private pool owners with hourly renters, essentially Airbnb reimagined for suburban backyards across the country. Everyone's doing it now, Diane said, sliding one brochure smoothly across the table toward me. Your pool alone could pull in $2,000 a month. Easy. With that fence and those privacy hedges you've got back there. I laughed politely and explained I had 2 young kids and absolutely no interest in strangers wandering through our yard, especially not while I was working 12-hour hospital shifts most weeks of the month. Diane's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second, something calculating passing behind her eyes before she quickly recovered, insisting she was just trying to help a fellow single mom get a little ahead financially. I did not know then that Diane had already listed 3 other Willowbrook pools on Splash Share without full owner consent, using a clause quietly buried inside a community amenity partnership she had added to the bylaws the year before. That clause, I would eventually learn, let the HOA designate shared recreational access to any pool visible from a public right-of-way, a convenient loophole Diane had written herself and never actually put to any genuine community vote. At the time, all I knew was that she seemed a little too interested in my pool for someone I barely knew, and something quiet in my gut told me, unmistakably, to keep my guard fully up around her. 2 weeks later, a man in a bright polo shirt knocked on my door holding a clipboard, cheerfully asking where he should park for his 2 o'clock reservation, and I genuinely had no idea what on earth he meant. He showed me a printed confirmation from Splash Share listing my exact address, my pool's photo clearly lifted from the community newsletter, and a specific booking time slot reserved for a children's birthday party of 12 guests. I told him firmly there had to be some mistake, that I had never once listed my property anywhere, and watched his polite confusion slowly curdle into irritation as he pulled out his phone to call customer service. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the listing host was named D. Kowalski, Willowbrook HOA official partner, complete with a verified badge icon claiming official community authority. And my stomach dropped as every piece suddenly clicked painfully into place. I called Diane immediately, my voice shaking with a fury I had not felt this intensely since the worst weeks of my divorce, demanding she explain exactly why strangers were showing up at my gate expecting a private pool party. Diane answered breezy and completely unbothered, casually saying she had simply included my address under the community partnership clause since my pool was, in her words, underutilized and the HOA badly needed new revenue for landscaping projects. You cannot rent out my private backyard without asking me first, I said, struggling hard to keep my voice level with Emma and Jake watching cartoons only a few feet away from this entire insane conversation. Diane sighed as though I were the unreasonable one in this exchange, vaguely promising she would look into pulling the listing, though something cold in her tone told me she had zero real intention of doing so quickly. I turned the confused, apologetic stranger away that afternoon, apologizing for a mess that was never actually mine to apologize for, then spent that entire night scrolling SplashShare until I finally found the listing myself. There it was. In plain sight, private oasis pool, Willowbrook Estates, my actual pool photograph front and center, 5 glowing star reviews from bookings I had never approved, and a calendar packed with reservations stretching 3 full weeks into the future. The listing's host bio read, managed by Willowbrook HOA for community benefit, with Diane's personal cell number listed as the contact, quietly collecting every single payment directly through her own private account, not the HOA's official one. I screenshotted everything methodically, hands trembling with anger and a strange, cold clarity, the exact kind of clarity I get during a crisis in the ER when a situation turns critical and pure instinct simply takes over from panic. The next morning I drove straight to the HOA office inside the community clubhouse, demanding Diane remove the fraudulent listing immediately or face an actual lawyer over unauthorized commercial use of my private residential property. Diane sat behind her desk completely unbothered, sliding a printed copy of the Community Amenity Partnership clause toward me, insisting my own signature on the original HOA agreement technically covered exactly this kind of arrangement. I read the clause twice carefully, and while the language was deliberately vague, nowhere did it actually grant explicit permission to book paying strangers into my fenced backyard, the exact place where my own children swam every single weekend. I never agreed to this, I said flatly, and Diane's expression cooled into something noticeably harder, the friendly mask slipping just enough to show me, for the very first time, the woman actually underneath it. You signed the HOA agreement, Sarah. Everyone did. Fine print carefully enough. That is really on you. Not on me, she said, tapping the paper sharply with one manicured nail. I left that meeting shaking, not from fear exactly, but from sheer disbelief that a woman elected to protect our community had quietly built an entire side business exploiting the very homes she was supposedly sworn to govern fairly. That night I called my sister Rachel, a paralegal working in Raleigh, who listened patiently to the whole absurd story and immediately said the clause sounded specifically designed to be legally unenforceable, added without any proper board ratification whatsoever. Get the original bylaws you signed at closing, Rachel told me firmly. and compare every single line against what she is showing you now. HOAs cannot legally just rewrite rules without a properly documented vote. I spent my next 2 full days off digging carefully through my closing paperwork. And sure enough, the entire Community Amenity Partnership clause did not exist anywhere within the version I had actually signed 8 months earlier. Diane had apparently added it during a supposed emergency amendment, claimed to have been approved at a March meeting I never received any notice for, one that, according to Priya, barely 5 residents had even bothered attending. Armed with all of this, I emailed the HOA's property management company directly, demanding the listing be removed immediately and requesting a full accounting of exactly how much money Diane had personally collected from my private pool. The property management company, turned out, was practically a hollow shell, a single overworked contractor named Gary who managed 6 separate HOAs and mostly just deferred every meaningful decision straight back to Diane herself. Gary responded 2 full days later with a canned form email, saying amenity disputes fell strictly under board discretion and suggesting I simply raise the matter formally at the next quarterly meeting, which was still 3 long weeks away. Meanwhile, the bookings kept relentlessly coming, strangers ringing my doorbell at all hours of the day, confused and sometimes visibly annoyed when I explained, yet again, that there was no pool party happening anywhere near my actual house. One booking guest, a young mother with 3 small kids already dressed in swimsuits, cried right there in my driveway, saying she had paid $90 whole for what was supposed to be a birthday celebration. I refunded her out of my own pocket just to stop her tears. A small kindness that cost me money I genuinely did not have to spare, while the actual thief responsible for the mess sat comfortably just 2 houses down the street. Emma started quietly asking why strangers kept knocking on our door, and I hated the small flicker of worry in her eyes more than almost anything else Diane had done to my family up to that exhausting point. Jake, only 7 years old, began asking nervously if we needed to move away again, a question that absolutely gutted me since we had only just settled after the divorce, and stability was the one promise I had made him. I installed a temporary padlock on the pool gate myself that very weekend, a desperate stopgap measure, though it meant my own kids now needed my help just to get into their own backyard pool safely. Priya came over with a bottle of wine and plenty of outrage, telling me Diane had pulled something eerily similar on the Whitfields 2 years back, listing their driveway as event parking during football season without ever asking permission first. The Whitfields, according to Priya, had simply paid whatever it took to make it stop rather than fight, eventually moving out within the year, unwilling to spend their retirement savings battling a woman with seemingly unlimited free time and energy. She has done this before and gotten away with it every single time, Priya warned me seriously, because nobody ever stays and actually fights back. You are the first person who has pushed back this hard, this fast. That warning settled into my chest like a genuine challenge, and something inside me, already worn thin by months of divorce paperwork and endless double shifts, quietly decided I was done being anyone's easy, convenient target. I formally requested official HOA financial records under North Carolina's Homeowner Association disclosure laws, a legal right Rachel assured me existed regardless of whatever Diane's conveniently amended bylaws claimed to say otherwise about disclosure. Diane stalled for 11 long days, citing vague administrative delays, before finally sending over a partial ledger that conveniently excluded any line item resembling splash share income or personal reimbursements routed directly back to herself. I noticed instead a curious, suspicious pattern. landscaping invoices priced nearly double the going market rate, all paid to a company called KR Property Solutions, which Rachel quickly discovered was actually registered to Diane's own husband, Rick. Suddenly the whole picture sharpened considerably. This was not simply petty control freak behavior anymore. It was a woman quietly siphoning HOA funds through her husband's shell company while simultaneously renting out her neighbor's pools on the side. I did not have solid proof of everything yet. Only loose threads. But enough threads pulled hard enough eventually unravel any sweater completely. And I fully intended to keep pulling until the whole thing finally came apart at the seams. At the next scheduled quarterly HOA meeting, I stood up during open comments and calmly laid out the unauthorized listing, the conveniently missing bylaw vote, and the suspiciously inflated landscaping invoices. Document by careful document. Diane's face went rigid with tension as murmurs quickly spread through the crowded room. Several neighbors exchanging uneasy glances that suggested I was clearly not the only one who had quietly noticed something off about the community's finances. She recovered quickly, though, accusing me loudly of harassment and spreading unverified rumors, reminding the entire room that as HOA president she legally held discretion over community partnerships and vendor selection decisions. A retired accountant named Mr. Hendricks, who had sat silently through years of these tense meetings, finally raised his hand and asked, quite simply, to see the actual vendor selection process for KR Property Solutions. Diane deflected smoothly, promising to circle back with proper documentation. A phrase I had already learned by then meant absolutely nothing would ever actually arrive. And the tense meeting adjourned with the air thick enough to genuinely choke on. Walking out afterward, 3 separate neighbors quietly approached me one by one, whispering their own stories, inflated fines, mysterious amenity partnerships, landscaping bills that never once matched the actual visible state of the community's common areas. It became increasingly clear that Diane had not just specifically targeted me. She had carefully built a quiet system of small financial extractions across the entire neighborhood, correctly betting that most people would rather simply pay than fight back. I started a shared document with Priya and 2 other concerned neighbors, methodically cataloging every questionable fine, every unexplained invoice, every mysterious amendment nobody actually remembered voting on, building a real case one careful entry at a time. Diane, clearly sensing the shift in mood, tried a completely different tactic entirely: sweetness, dropping off a fruit basket at my front door with a card apologizing for the pool confusion and promising it was already handled. The splash share listing, however, remained stubbornly live, quietly renamed Community Wellness Pool, with my address still fully attached. A small but telling detail proving her sweet apology meant absolutely nothing real at all. I screenshotted the newly renamed listing immediately, adding it to our steadily growing shared folder, now fully certain that Diane would only ever stop when genuinely forced to, never simply because it was the right thing to do. 2 nights later, my exterior security camera caught Diane herself walking slowly along my side fence at 11 p.m., photographing my pool area from angles that were clearly, unmistakably meant for a fresh rental listing. I confronted her directly the next morning, camera footage held firmly in hand, and for the first time watched her genuinely stumble for an excuse, muttering something vague about checking fence compliance that fooled absolutely no one present. "You were on my property at night without permission, photographing the exact place where my children swim," I said, my voice flat and cold in a way that genuinely surprised even me as I heard myself speaking. Diane's eyes narrowed sharply, and the mask dropped further still. This neighborhood runs smoothly because I make the hard calls nobody else ever wants to make. You will thank me eventually, she said coldly. That single arrogant sentence told me absolutely everything I needed to know. This was never really about revenue for landscaping or community amenities anymore. It was purely about control. About a woman who genuinely believed she owned all of us. I filed a formal trespassing complaint with the local police that very same day. More to create an official record than genuinely expecting real consequences, since technically this still counted as an internal HOA dispute. The responding officer was sympathetic but ultimately limited, noting the incident carefully and advising me to pursue a formal restraining order if the concerning behavior continued. Paperwork I began quietly researching that very same night. Diane, entirely undeterred by any of this, escalated instead of retreating, sending a certified letter citing me for obstruction of community amenity access over my new pool padlock, threatening a genuinely staggering $500 daily fine. $500 a day was substantially more than my entire mortgage payment, an amount clearly designed not to enforce any real legitimate rule but to financially punish me directly into silence and full compliance. I called Rachel in an absolute panic, and she calmly reminded me that fines requiring formal board approval could not simply be issued unilaterally by one single person, certified letter or not, no matter how official it appeared on paper. We requested the meeting minutes supposedly approving this brand new fine schedule. And, quite unsurprisingly, none actually existed. Just another fabricated layer of authority stacked atop the already growing pile of Diane's entirely manufactured rules and consequences. Priya suggested we start openly recording every HOA meeting from now on. Phones visible right there on the table, since North Carolina allowed one-party consent recording. And transparency was clearly the one thing Diane genuinely feared most of all. At the following meeting, cameras quietly rolling, I calmly asked Diane to produce the meeting minutes for her certified fine notice, watching her scramble visibly through folders that obviously contained no such document whatsoever. The room's silence stretched uncomfortably long before Mr. Hendricks finally spoke up again, quietly suggesting the board seriously consider a full formal financial audit. A motion two other board members immediately, decisively seconded without hesitation. Diane, now visibly cornered, pivoted sharply, accusing me of targeting her out of some imagined personal grudge, insisting the audit was completely unnecessary and that she would simply waive my fine entirely to end the whole discussion. I refused the waiver firmly on principle, telling the room plainly that I wanted the full audit regardless, because this had genuinely stopped being about my pool alone and become instead about accountability for the entire community. The audit motion passed decisively, 4 votes to 1, with Diane herself the lone dissenting vote. And for the first time in 6 long years, an independent accountant would finally review Willowbrook's books line by careful line. Diane left that particular meeting early, her usual smooth composure visibly cracked, and I genuinely felt something important shift in the neighborhood's air, like a long-held breath finally beginning, slowly, to release itself. A brief, fragile calm settled over Willowbrook after that pivotal meeting. The splash share listing quietly vanished entirely. No new strangers appeared at my gate, and Diane's usual weekly citation newsletters simply stopped arriving altogether. I let myself believe, for about 2 hopeful weeks, that this might actually simply be over, That public exposure alone had been enough to make Diane finally retreat and behave like a normal, reasonable neighbor again. Emma and Jake fully reclaimed the pool during that stretch. The temporary padlock finally coming off. Splashing and laughing happily through long July afternoons while I watched contentedly from a lounge chair, genuinely allowing myself to relax for once. Priya and I joked over coffee one morning that maybe Diane had simply given up entirely. That 6 years of unchecked power had finally met its match in one tired nurse who simply refused to quietly give up and quit. The independent auditor, a sharp and thorough woman named Ms. Okafor, requested 3 full years of financial records, vendor contracts, and board meeting minutes. A request Diane fulfilled with unusual, almost suspiciously eager cooperation. That eagerness should have worried me considerably more than it did at the time. Looking back now, Diane was not cooperating out of guilt at all. She was simply buying precious time to quietly rebuild her defenses somewhere I could not yet see. Rick, Diane's husband, appeared at a community summer barbecue for the first time in months. Unusually charming and talkative, striking up casual conversation with several neighbors, including myself, asking careful questions about the audit's overall progress. I mentioned very little, wary of his sudden, unexpected friendliness, though he let slip that Diane had been under a lot of pressure lately, since the HOA presidency was, apparently, the only real thing she had in her life. That particular comment stuck with me far longer than I expected, revealing a small crack of something almost sad beneath Diane's tyranny. Though genuine sympathy did not erase what she had already done to my family and my kids. 2 weeks into that fragile calm, Diane resurfaced unexpectedly at a smaller planning committee meeting, proposing a brand new neighborhood beautification fund, conveniently requiring every single household to contribute $200 immediately, no questions asked. The fund, she carefully explained, would cover emergency landscaping near the front entrance gate, though no specific project or licensed contractor was actually named, and no competing bids had ever been solicited from anyone else. Mr. Several pointed questions about the fund's genuine necessity given the ongoing audit, and Diane's answers grew increasingly vague, circling repeatedly back to fuzzy phrases like community pride and improving curb appeal for everyone. I voted firmly no, along with 2 other skeptical residents, but the measure still passed by a narrow margin, mostly thanks to residents who had not closely followed the earlier drama and simply trusted Diane's confident, polished presentation. Money started quietly moving again, into accounts only Diane fully and personally controlled, and I felt the fragile calm of those past 2 weeks beginning to visibly crack under fresh, uncomfortably familiar unease settling back in. Then the auditor's preliminary findings finally arrived, flagging over $11,000 in landscaping invoices from KR Property Solutions that did not match any verifiable, actually completed work in the community's shared common areas. Diane responded to the preliminary report furiously, calling Ms. Okafor's entire methodology biased and demanding a completely separate second auditor. A costly request the board narrowly approved despite my strong, vocal objections raised directly at the meeting. The resulting delay bought Diane precious additional time, and I began noticing her spending far more hours than usual visiting other individual homeowners alone, always carrying a thick folder of papers tucked firmly under her arm. Priya reported that Diane had visited her too, subtly suggesting that some people were stirring up unnecessary drama that could seriously hurt everyone's property values. A not-so-veiled reference to me, specifically, by name during that private conversation. Diane was quietly building an entire counter-narrative, carefully positioning herself as the innocent victim of a personal vendetta rather than a woman genuinely facing legitimate financial scrutiny. And disturbingly, some neighbors actually seemed to believe her completely. I started receiving distinctly cold looks from a few residents at the shared mailbox cluster. Whispered conversations trailing off suspiciously whenever I approached. The particular quiet loneliness of being publicly labeled difficult in a tight-knit small community. My demanding work schedule made fighting all of this even harder than it already was. Between 12-hour hospital shifts and solo parenting duties, I had maybe 2 free hours most nights to organize documents and answer Rachel's careful questions. Rachel, sensing my growing exhaustion, offered to formally consult on the entire case, drafting a detailed letter to the second auditor outlining exactly which invoices and bylaw amendments deserved the very closest possible scrutiny going forward. Diane, apparently informed of this exact letter through property manager Gary, showed up completely unannounced at my house one evening, her friendly mask entirely gone, replaced instead by something noticeably sharper and considerably colder than before. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with," she said quietly on my doorstep, her voice low so the kids would not hear inside. "I have handled far bigger threats than a single mom with a personal grudge." I told her, as calmly as I could manage with my heart genuinely pounding, that this was never personal at all, that I simply wanted the community's shared money spent honestly and my own family finally left completely alone. Diane laughed sharply, short and completely humorless. "Nothing is ever personal until it becomes personal," she said, already turning to leave. "And trust me, Sarah, it is about to get very, very personal for you specifically." That chilling threat sat heavy in my chest for many days afterward, and I began documenting absolutely everything even more obsessively, saving every email, every timestamp, every screenshot to a shared cloud folder accessible to both Rachel and Priya. A week later, my mailbox flag mysteriously appeared bent every single morning, small enough each time to seem purely accidental, until I finally noticed Diane's car idling suspiciously near my driveway right before each strange occurrence happened. Then Jake's bicycle, left innocently in our own driveway overnight, completely vanished, only to mysteriously reappear the next afternoon inside the community clubhouse's lost and found, officially reported abandoned on shared community property. These were small, carefully deniable acts of quiet harassment, each one individually explainable on its own, together forming an unmistakable pattern clearly designed to unsettle me without ever leaving evidence solid enough for any formal legal complaint. I began varying how and where I parked my car, slightly changing my daily schedule, a creeping paranoia I fully recognized but genuinely could not quite shake off. The same hypervigilance I remembered from the very worst months of my divorce. Emma noticed my growing tension despite my best efforts to hide it completely, asking one quiet night if the pool lady was going to make us move away again. A simple question that absolutely broke something inside me. I promised her fiercely that we were not going anywhere at all. A promise I meant with my whole heart, even as quiet fear whispered that Diane might actually make good on whatever very personal threat she had left hanging heavy in the air. The second auditor, a thorough man named Frank Delgado, began his own independent review, and within just a week reached out to me directly, asking careful, detailed questions about my original splash share screenshots and documentation. Frank mentioned, almost offhandedly during our call, that Diane's KR Property Solutions invoices matched patterns he had personally seen before in a completely different HOA fraud case 2 counties over, one that had ultimately ended in serious criminal charges. That specific detail landed like a genuine jolt of electricity. This was clearly not Diane's very first rodeo. Possibly not even her first community exploited this exact same way. A realization that instantly reframed everything I had assumed about her. Frank asked my permission to cross-reference Willowbrook's records against public court filings, and within just days uncovered that Diane had served as HOA treasurer, under her own maiden name, at a Georgia community many years earlier. That Georgia HOA had quietly settled a civil lawsuit over misappropriated maintenance funds, with records sealed tightly by a non-disclosure agreement that had, until this very moment, kept Diane's troubling history conveniently invisible to everyone in Willowbrook. Rachel found the exact connection almost entirely by accident while separately researching Rick's business filings, discovering he had also co-signed that very same NDA, meaning both of them had already buried this exact pattern once before. Together, I sat quietly with this staggering information for a long time that night, watching my kids sleep peacefully, finally understanding that I was not dealing with a merely overzealous rule follower but a practiced, calculating, repeat offender with a real history. The realization genuinely terrified me and steadied me in equal, strange measure. Terrified because she clearly knew exactly how to make consequences disappear. Steadied because now I finally understood precisely what I was truly up against. I shared everything immediately with Frank, who agreed the pattern was significant enough to escalate well beyond a routine HOA audit, quietly suggesting we loop in the county's Consumer Protection Division as soon as reasonably possible. Diane, completely unaware of how much we had already uncovered, doubled down publicly instead, hosting an emergency town hall to address what she dramatically called false accusations threatening to tear apart our beloved community. At that particular town hall, she painted herself as a tireless volunteer sacrificing her own precious time for Willowbrook's benefit, unfairly targeted by a small group harboring personal grievances against dedicated community leadership. Several neighbors nodded along sympathetically, genuinely moved by her polished performance, and I felt the old familiar exhaustion creeping quietly back in, the particular fatigue of fighting someone truly skilled at making the plain truth sound like simple cruelty. But Mr. N. more quietly this time, and simply asked whether Diane would consent to fully releasing her complete financial history as HOA treasurer from that previous community back in Georgia. The crowded room went silent in a completely different way than before, not confused silence this time, but the very specific silence of dozens of people suddenly recalculating everything they thought they had ever known about her. Diane's smooth composure finally, visibly cracked wide open, all the color draining rapidly from her face as she demanded to know where exactly that information came from, her voice rising sharply in a way I had honestly never heard before. I said absolutely nothing in response, letting the heavy silence and her own visible reaction speak entirely for themselves, watching 6 long years of carefully constructed authority begin, in that single frozen moment, to genuinely, visibly wobble. She ended the town hall abruptly, claiming some vague family emergency, though Rick, sitting quietly near the back of the room, looked just as blindsided by this sudden revelation as absolutely everyone else in that stuffy clubhouse room. Driving home afterward, Priya squeezed my arm warmly and said quietly, "I genuinely think we finally cracked something real tonight, and for the very first time in weeks, I actually let myself believe her completely." The fragile calm did not last long, though 2 days later, Frank called to say Diane's own administrative assistant, a young HOA aide named Kelly, had reached out wanting to talk privately, entirely off the record. Kelly met Rachel and me at a quiet coffee shop just outside the neighborhood, visibly nervous the whole time, explaining she had been quietly documenting things for months, genuinely afraid to speak up alone against someone so powerful and connected. She showed us an entire folder of internal emails, Diane instructing Gary to quietly lose certain invoices before scheduled audits, and messages carefully coordinating splash share bookings across at least 4 different Willowbrook properties simultaneously. Kelly also revealed something absolutely none of us had suspected before. Diane had been secretly recording every HOA board meeting, using the raw footage to selectively edit official minutes that conveniently supported whatever narrative she currently needed. This meant every single meeting minute we had relied on so far could be partially fabricated. A realization that sent Rachel scrambling immediately to cross-check dates and attendance records against Kelly's raw, entirely unedited original recordings. Kelly's genuine bravery gave us something we desperately needed all along, an insider's complete paper trail connecting every single fine, every fund, every fabricated amendment directly back to Diane's own handwriting and digital fingerprints. I hugged Kelly tightly before she quietly left, thanking her sincerely, fully aware of how much genuine courage it took for a 23-year-old to risk her entire job exposing a woman this practiced at swift, calculated retaliation. That very same week, Diane's quiet harassment campaign escalated sharply. My car received an anonymous parking violation notice for being improperly angled in my own private driveway, an obviously completely fabricated citation designed purely to intimidate. Then someone anonymously reported my above-ground grill to the local fire marshal as a code violation, triggering a full inspection that found absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever, wasting an entire afternoon I genuinely could not spare from work. I recognized the pattern clearly now. Diane escalating carefully through official-looking channels, she still had just enough remaining influence to weaponize, even as the solid ground genuinely shifted rapidly beneath her crumbling position of power. Frank's formal audit report finally arrived, definitively confirming over $23,000 in unaccounted HOA funds routed through KR Property Solutions over 18 months. A truly staggering figure for our relatively modest suburban community. The board scheduled an emergency vote on Diane's immediate removal as president, the very first such vote in Willowbrook's entire history, and word spread through the neighborhood faster than any weekly newsletter ever had before. Diane, clearly sensing the walls rapidly closing in around her, shifted tactics entirely, no longer purely defensive, but strangely, unsettlingly calm, telling Rick over dinner, as Kelly later informed us, that she had a plan ready. I did not yet know what that ominous plan actually was, only that Diane Kowalski had never once, in 6 full years, gone down without dragging something or someone else down alongside her in the process. The night before the scheduled removal vote, my security camera caught Diane's car parked outside my house yet again, engine idling for nearly 20 full minutes before finally driving slowly away into the darkness. I barely slept at all that particular night, checking on Emma and Jake twice, unable to shake the growing feeling that whatever Diane's mysterious plan truly was, it was going to arrive specifically at my address. The following morning, the emergency board meeting formally convened, and by a decisive vote of 6-1, Diane Kowalski was officially removed as HOA president. Effective immediately, pending a full and complete financial investigation. Diane did not argue at all, did not protest even once, simply gathered her folder calmly and left the clubhouse with an eerie, deeply unsettling composure that felt far more genuinely dangerous than her earlier open fury ever had. I should have felt purely victorious walking out of that meeting. Instead, a cold unease settled quietly over me. The very specific dread of knowing a fight was not actually finished, just entering a new, considerably darker phase entirely. That unease proved entirely justified within just 48 hours. When Splash Share bookings for my exact address suddenly reappeared online, this time listed under a completely different host name I did not recognize at all. The brand new listing described an upcoming farewell summer bash with a 200 guest capacity, a flat entry fee of $15 per person, heavily promoted across 3 separate local Facebook community event pages within hours. I discovered it only because Priya's cousin, scrolling casually for weekend plans, recognized my house's distinctive blue shutters clearly visible in the listing photos and immediately sent Priya a frantic, urgent screenshot right away. The event was scheduled for that coming Saturday, just 3 short days away, already showing over 180 confirmed RSVPs when I first personally discovered the fraudulent listing myself late that night. I reported it to Splash Share's official support line immediately, providing solid proof of ownership, but received only an automated response promising review within 5 to 7 business days, entirely useless against a mere 3-day deadline. Frank helped me trace the brand new host account, registered under the name R. Kowalski, using Rick's personal email address, though Diane's fingerprints remained unmistakable across every single promotional detail of the fraudulent listing itself. This was clearly no longer about generating simple revenue anymore. It was not even genuinely about the money. It was pure retaliation. A final desperate act of sabotage timed precisely to hit hardest right after her humiliating public removal from power. I called the local police non-emergency line immediately, carefully explaining the entire escalating situation, but was told plainly that without an active crime already in progress, there was regrettably little they could proactively do beforehand. Rachel quickly drafted an emergency cease and desist letter, sent directly to both Diane and Rick, while also simultaneously filing a formal fraud complaint with Splash Share's dedicated fraud division, citing prior documented evidence from my earlier case. Despite all our combined efforts, the listing remained stubbornly live throughout Thursday and Friday, RSVPs climbing steadily past 200 by Friday evening, a genuinely staggering number that made my stomach turn completely over with dread. I seriously considered simply leaving town entirely with the kids for the weekend, avoiding the whole impending disaster altogether. But something fierce inside me refused to abandon my own home to Diane's final, desperate, spiteful stunt. Instead, I called a trusted friend from my old nursing program, now working professionally in private security, who agreed immediately to help me install additional protective measures around the property before Saturday morning finally arrived. We carefully reinforced the pool gate's existing automatic locking mechanism, a smart lock system I had actually installed weeks earlier purely for the kids' basic safety, now repurposed as a genuine barrier against 200 completely uninvited strangers. I also contacted the county sheriff's department directly, carefully explaining the specific, well-documented threat, and finally secured a firm promise that a patrol unit would remain nearby Saturday morning, purely as a precaution just in case. Priya, Mr. Hendricks, and Kelly all generously offered to be physically present at my house Saturday morning too. An unexpected, moving show of genuine solidarity from a neighborhood that had, until quite recently, mostly just watched silently from a safe distance. Friday night, I barely slept again, checking the smart lock app repeatedly on my phone, mentally rehearsing exactly what I would say to confused strangers arriving at my gate expecting a party that was never, ever genuinely mine to host. Saturday morning arrived gray and thick with humidity, the kind of heavy Carolina heat that quietly promises an afternoon thunderstorm later. And by 9 a.m., the very first confused arrivals were already parking haphazardly along my quiet street. By 9:30, cars lined both sides of the entire cul-de-sac, families unloading coolers and colorful pool floats, children in swimsuits bouncing with genuine excitement for a party that existed only inside Diane's vindictive imagination. I stood firmly at my front gate holding a printed sign reading, "This is a private residence. No event scheduled here." But the growing crowd multiplied faster than I could possibly explain the situation to everyone. Some arrivals turned around apologetically once I calmly spoke with them directly. Others, having already paid their entry fee, grew visibly frustrated and insisted the listing clearly showed this exact address, demanding refunds I genuinely could not provide them. By 10 o'clock, nearly 60 people had crowded densely into my front yard, and I watched in growing horror as one group, misreading the general chaos as simply disorganized hosting, wandered directly toward my locked side gate. "Stop! Please! This is a private backyard," I shouted desperately, but the overwhelming noise of excited children and irritated adults completely swallowed my voice as more and more people funneled steadily around the side of my house. My smart lock app buzzed furiously with a rapid stream of notifications, the side gate sensor triggering again and again as person after person pushed steadily through, the automatic security system registering each individual entry exactly as it was originally designed to do. I had built the smart lock system to auto-secure itself after detecting unusual entry patterns, a safety feature originally meant purely to protect my kids from random strangers, never once imagining it would activate against an entire literal crowd like this. By 10:15 my phone alert read plainly, "Gate secured, multiple unauthorized entries detected," and I realized with a genuine jolt of dread that the automatic system had just completely locked the entire side gate shut. Nearly 200 confused people were now trapped inside my fully fenced backyard, and the only viable exit, the automatic gate itself, had sealed itself completely shut according to its own carefully programmed security protocol. Panic erupted almost instantly throughout the crowd. People pressed anxiously against the locked gate. Small children began crying loudly, and someone started shouting frantically that they were trapped, a word that spread through the crowd like wildfire. I fumbled desperately with my phone, trying repeatedly to override the smart lock system remotely, my hands shaking far too badly to type the correct passcode correctly on the first 3 increasingly desperate attempts I made. My security friend, thankfully already on-site helping, moved carefully through the anxious crowd trying to calm people down, loudly explaining this was simply a technical malfunction, not any genuine danger, while I kept furiously working the override. The sheriff's patrol unit, already positioned nearby exactly as promised earlier, arrived within just minutes, deputies helping efficiently manage the increasingly frantic crowd while I finally, Finally got the override code entered correctly on my third try. The gate released suddenly with a sharp mechanical click. And visible relief washed through the entire yard as people began filing calmly out, shaken but completely unharmed. Many now loudly demanding answers about who had actually organized this entire disaster. A deputy approached me directly and calmly, and I explained absolutely everything: the fraudulent splash share listing, Diane's recent removal as HOA president, the clearly retaliatory booking made deliberately under her husband's name just days earlier. As I spoke, my phone buzzed sharply with an urgent message from Kelly. Check the listing's payment account right now. It is not Rick's card on file at all. It is the actual HOA Reserve Fund debit card. That single devastating detail changed absolutely everything. Diane had not simply retaliated against me personally. She had used genuinely stolen HOA reserve funds to pay for the very advertising that had lured 200 strangers directly to my gate. The deputy, hearing this shocking new financial detail, immediately radioed for a detective to respond. Correctly recognizing this had now shifted from a mere neighborhood dispute into something closely resembling organized fraud and genuine public endangerment. Within the hour, a sharp detective named Ruiz arrived on scene, taking my detailed statement methodically while carefully photographing the smart lock system, the crowd dispersal, and the fraudulent splash share listing still clearly visible on my phone screen. Detective Ruiz mentioned, almost casually while writing notes, that the department had received a separate complaint just that very morning from a woman named Denise Caraway regarding a nearly identical scheme back in Georgia years earlier. My stomach flipped sharply. Denise Caraway, turned out, was the actual plaintiff from that sealed Georgia settlement Frank had previously uncovered, and she had apparently been quietly tracking Diane's whereabouts ever since that original case concluded. Denise, upon learning through mutual contacts that Diane Kowalski had resurfaced quietly in North Carolina, had immediately filed a fresh complaint the moment she recognized the exact same pattern beginning to repeat itself here. This meant law enforcement already had an open investigative file connecting Diane directly to prior fraud allegations, and my utterly chaotic Saturday morning had just handed them fresh, active, entirely undeniable evidence to build their case upon. As the very last stragglers finally left my yard, muttering apologies and lingering confusion, I finally sat down heavily on my porch steps, adrenaline crashing hard, watching Emma and Jake peek nervously out from behind the window curtains. I called them outside carefully once the yard was completely clear, hugging them both tightly, promising sincerely that this entire chaos was finally over now, even though some distant part of me quietly suspected one final confrontation still remained ahead. That final confrontation arrived far faster than I expected. By early afternoon, Diane herself appeared suddenly at the very end of my driveway, apparently having heard just how badly her retaliation plan had completely unraveled. She looked entirely different than I had ever seen her before. Hair visibly disheveled, makeup smudged badly, none of the polished, confident authority that had successfully intimidated an entire neighborhood for 6 consecutive long years. "You have absolutely no idea what you have done," she hissed furiously, storming closer until Detective Ruiz, still on scene finishing his paperwork, stepped smoothly and firmly between us with a raised, clearly warning hand extended. "Ma'am, I need you to stay back right now," Ruiz said calmly but firmly, and something about his authoritative tone finally seemed to genuinely register with Diane, her fury visibly deflating slightly into something much closer to real fear. "This is pure harassment. Diane snapped defensively, though her voice cracked noticeably on the word. I am the actual victim here. She has been targeting me for months over a simple misunderstanding about pool sharing. Ruiz, entirely unmoved by her protests, informed her plainly that the department was actively investigating unauthorized use of HOA reserve funds, connecting her directly to today's incident and an already open complaint from Georgia authorities as well. Diane's face went completely white, the polished mask finally, completely gone, replaced entirely by raw, unguarded panic as she realized just how thoroughly and how quickly her carefully built narrative had collapsed entirely around her. I want a lawyer right now, she said quietly. And Ruiz nodded evenly, informing her she was technically free to leave for the moment but should genuinely expect formal contact from detectives within the coming days ahead. I watched her walk slowly back toward her own house, shoulders visibly hunched in a way I had genuinely never once seen in 6 full years of encountering her confident, controlling presence throughout our entire neighborhood. Rick appeared quietly on their front porch as she approached, his expression completely unreadable, and I found myself wondering, not without some genuine pity, how much he had truly known about everything his wife had secretly built. That evening, utterly exhausted beyond words, I sat quietly with Priya on my porch, both of us slowly processing the sheer, overwhelming scale of what had unfolded in a single, genuinely unbelievable morning together. 200 people. Sarah, Priya said, shaking her head in disbelief. She genuinely thought locking your entire backyard full of strangers would somehow hurt you worse than it would ultimately hurt herself in the end. I laughed, a slightly hysterical sound escaping me, suddenly realizing the gate had not trapped my family at all. It had actually trapped the very chaos Diane herself had engineered, sealing the evidence of her own crime neatly inside my yard. Over the following days, the incredible story spread rapidly through the neighborhood, then well beyond it. A local news reporter eagerly picking up the bizarre tale of an HOA president's pool rental scheme gone catastrophically, spectacularly wrong. The eventual headline read, HOA president's backyard pool scam traps 200 strangers behind smart gate. And within just a single day, the story had already been shared thousands of times across various social media platforms. Reporters began requesting interviews, and though I genuinely hesitated at first, worried about my kids' privacy, I eventually agreed to one carefully worded statement focused entirely on accountability rather than sensationalized personal drama for the cameras. Detective Ruiz's investigation moved forward quickly once the story went fully public, mounting pressure building as more and more Willowbrook residents came forward with their own documented experiences of fines, threats, and quiet financial exploitation. Denise Caraway, the original Georgia plaintiff, reached out to me personally through Detective Ruiz, and we spoke by phone for nearly a full hour, comparing detailed notes on patterns eerily similar across both our separate communities. She always starts small, Denise told me thoughtfully. Little fines, subtle little bits of control, testing carefully who pushes back against her. Then once she finds someone who genuinely will not back down, she escalates relentlessly until it breaks them or her. I told Denise that this particular time seemed escalation had finally broken Diane herself instead, and she laughed softly with clear relief, saying she had been waiting a full 7 years to finally hear someone say exactly that to her. Formal criminal charges arrived 12 full days later. 3 separate counts of embezzlement, 2 counts of fraud, and 1 count of unauthorized use of a financial instrument, all tied directly to the stolen HOA reserve card. The Georgia case, now formally reopened under this compelling new evidence, added additional charges from that separate jurisdiction, meaning Diane now faced potential prosecution across 2 entirely different states for remarkably similar patterns of calculated behavior. Rick, questioned separately by detectives, claimed absolutely no knowledge of the reserve fund theft specifically, though investigators found his signature clearly on several KR Property Solutions invoices, considerably complicating his claims of complete personal innocence throughout. The couple's marriage, according to persistent neighborhood whispers I mostly tried hard to ignore, was reportedly unraveling badly under all the mounting pressure, Rick eventually moving into a rental unit clear across town within just the month. Willowbrook's board quickly scheduled a full community meeting to address the necessary next steps, electing Mr. Hendricks as interim president, a decision that passed completely unanimously and felt, finally, like genuine relief settling warmly over everyone present. At that particular meeting, residents voted decisively to formally dissolve the amended Community Amenity Partnership clause entirely, restoring the original bylaws I had signed at closing, the very ones that never once mentioned renting out private pools. Kelly was offered a permanent administrative role with full genuine authority previously withheld from her entirely, a small but deeply meaningful recognition of the real courage it took to come forward against her former powerful boss. I received an unexpected, formal community apology at that same meeting, a little overwhelming honestly. Several neighbors who had once given me cold looks now sincerely thanking me for refusing to simply pay quietly and disappear from view. Priya squeezed my hand warmly throughout the whole meeting, and I found myself, for the very first time in months, actually looking forward to future HOA meetings rather than dreading them like some kind of recurring nightmare. The recovered $11,000 from the original landscaping fraud, along with additional funds later traced through Diane's various accounts, were carefully earmarked for genuine community improvements, including finally fixing the entrance gate's long-broken keypad system. Emma asked me quietly if the pool lady was going away for good this time, and I told her honestly that grown-ups sometimes have to genuinely answer for the choices they make, just exactly like kids do themselves. Jake, ever the practical one, simply asked if we could finally have a truly normal pool party. Just our own family and a few close friends. No strangers at all. No drama. And definitely no locked gates involved. I promised him firmly that we absolutely would. Very soon. Once this whole exhausting chapter had properly and fully closed, and once I had finally had enough time to simply breathe without constantly checking a smart lock app every 10 anxious minutes. 6 full weeks after the incident, Diane's preliminary court hearing finally took place, and I attended alongside Priya, Kelly, and Mr. Hendricks, genuinely wanting to witness firsthand the accountability we had all fought so hard together to secure. Diane appeared noticeably smaller somehow inside that courtroom, stripped entirely of her clipboard and her certified letters, now just an ordinary woman facing real consequences of choices made across 2 full states and many quiet years. The prosecutor laid out the entire case methodically: the Seal, Georgia settlement, the Willowbrook embezzlement scheme, the fraudulent splash share listings, and finally the retaliatory reserve fund financed party that had drawn 200 strangers directly to my gate. Denise Caraway testified carefully via video link from Georgia, describing patterns from years earlier that matched. almost word for word. The exact same tactics Diane had recently used against me and my neighbors here in Willowbrook. My own testimony felt strangely calm and professional. That steady clinical instinct kicking in exactly the way it does during a genuinely difficult hospital shift. Steady, clear facts. A clean timeline. No room left over for doubt or manipulation. I described the original frog citation, the fraudulent splash share listing, the nighttime photography of my own children's pool, and finally the locked gate that had trapped 200 confused strangers inside my own private backyard. Diane's defense attorney attempted weakly to paint the whole gate incident as merely an unfortunate accident, entirely unrelated to any intentional wrongdoing. But the clear reserve fund payment trail made that flimsy argument collapse almost immediately in court. The presiding judge, carefully reviewing the mounting evidence, denied any bail reduction request and set a firm trial date, noting the deeply concerning pattern of escalation across multiple jurisdictions as solid grounds for continued judicial caution. Walking out of the courthouse together, warm sunlight finally breaking through months of accumulated tension. Priya turned to me and said simply, "You did that, Sarah. You actually stood there and genuinely did all of that." I did not feel purely triumphant exactly. More like someone finally setting down a heavy weight I had not even fully realized I had been carrying. A deep tension in my shoulders I could actually feel physically release at last. Over the following weeks, the story continued steadily unfolding in the local news. Other communities reaching out anonymously, quietly sharing their own long-held suspicions about HOA leaders exhibiting similarly controlling, financially murky behavior in their own neighborhoods. A local consumer protection nonprofit contacted me directly, asking if I would be willing to share my careful documentation process as a genuine template for other homeowners facing similar unchecked HOA authority elsewhere in the state. I agreed readily, partly because Rachel insisted it genuinely mattered to others, and partly because I clearly remembered how alone and confused I had felt that very first day a stranger showed up expecting a pool party at my house. Diane's Willowbrook house went up for sale within just 2 months. The simple "for sale" sign a strange, quiet punctuation mark on everything that had happened since that very first ceramic frog citation appeared on our door. Rick moved out permanently for good, and neighbors reportedly saw Diane only rarely after that. Always alone now, loading boxes slowly into a moving truck with none of her former confidant, controlling energy remaining visible anywhere. I felt, watching quietly from my porch one warm afternoon, not satisfaction exactly, but something closer to genuine closure. The specific quiet relief of watching a real threat finally, genuinely shrink smaller than yourself in front of you. Mr. Now serving as interim president, implemented several new transparency measures, published financial statements, fully recorded meetings, and a formal review process requiring genuine board votes for any future bylaw amendment going forward permanently. Kelly thrived visibly in her new expanded role, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the monthly newsletters now, filled with actual community events instead of thinly veiled threats disguised as petty violation notices from before. Priya and I hosted our very own pool party that summer, a genuinely real one this time, just neighbors and close friends. Kids splashing freely without a single locked gate or confused stranger anywhere in sight for once. Emma, floating happily on an inflatable flamingo, asked if the pool was finally just ours again for real, and I told her yes. It always truly had been. We had just needed to prove that fact ourselves. Jake declared it the best pool day ever. Mom, a small, wonderfully ordinary sentence that meant more to me than almost anything else across those exhausting, genuinely chaotic months of fighting for something so basic and simple. As autumn slowly approached, Diane's actual trial date finally arrived, and I attended once more, this time simply as a witness to the genuine ending rather than an active participant in the ongoing fight itself. Facing absolutely overwhelming evidence across both states, Diane ultimately accepted a formal plea deal, full restitution payments, a lengthy probation period, and a permanent, legally binding ban from ever serving in any HOA leadership role again. The judge specifically cited the gate incident during her formal sentencing remarks, noting plainly that using stolen community funds to genuinely endanger 200 people reflected a profound and troubling disregard for basic public safety overall. Diane showed absolutely no visible reaction as the final sentence was read aloud, staring straight ahead blankly, the exact same rigid composure I remembered from that very first citation over Emma's small ceramic garden frog months earlier. Outside the courthouse afterward, Denise Carraway approached me warmly, and we hugged briefly together, two strangers connected across years and states entirely by the same woman's carefully repeated pattern of quiet, calculated exploitation. You stopped her faster than anyone genuinely ever has before, Denise said sincerely. And I told her honestly that it had not felt fast at all to me, just relentless, one small stubborn document and refusal at a time. I drove home that evening with the windows rolled all the way down, warm air rushing freely through the car, feeling genuinely lighter than I had in over a full year, since long before this entire exhausting ordeal even began. Willowbrook itself changed noticeably over the following months. Neighbors greeting one another far more openly now. Meetings actually genuinely productive rather than tense. The entrance gate keypad finally, properly repaired and working smoothly for everyone. I ran for an open board seat myself that following fall, mostly at Priya's insistent, encouraging urging, wanting to help ensure whatever came after Diane never quietly slid back into the same old broken patterns again. I won the seat quite comfortably, sworn in alongside Mr. Hendricks and two other genuinely reform-minded neighbors, a small local victory that felt disproportionately meaningful after absolutely everything our whole community had endured together over that year. My very first act as a new board member was proposing mandatory annual financial audits, permanently written directly into the bylaws this time, requiring genuine homeowner votes for any future amendment going forward without exception. Kelly, now serving as full HOA administrator, joked warmly that our meetings had become almost boring compared to the wild Diane years, and I told her that boring was actually exactly the whole point of good governance done right. Emma's small ceramic frog, the very one that had started all of this, found its way happily back onto our front steps that October. No citation appearing this time, just autumn leaves gathering harmlessly and peacefully around it. Jake asked once, several months later, whatever had happened to the pool lady, and I explained simply that she had made choices that genuinely hurt other people, and eventually those choices had caught up completely with her. He nodded seriously in response, the exact way 7-year-olds do when quietly processing something genuinely important, then immediately asked if we could go swimming instead. And I realized that was actually exactly the right response to have. Rachel visited that following winter, and we sat together reviewing everything one final time, the frog citation, the fraudulent listing, the locked gate, The courtroom itself. A strange, deeply satisfying full circle finally completed together. You know, Rachel said thoughtfully, most people would have simply just paid the fine and quietly moved on with their lives. You are the actual reason an entire neighborhood got its real community back again. I told her honestly that I had not really done it for the neighborhood at all. Not at first anyway. I had done it because someone tried to profit off my own children's safety, and that I simply could not let that stand unchallenged. The community itself, though, had become an unexpected genuine gift from that whole exhausting fight. Real friendships forged in shared frustration and eventual relief. Connections I never would have made without Diane's blatant overreach in the first place. Priya and I still laugh sometimes about that entirely chaotic Saturday morning. 200 confused strangers. A smart lock system doing exactly what it was originally designed to do. Just not remotely how anyone had ever expected it to happen. The local news occasionally still references the Willowbrook pool case, whenever similar HOA fraud stories break elsewhere in the region. A strange little legacy neither Diane nor I ever once imagined this whole story would leave behind. Denise and I still text one another occasionally. An odd but genuinely warm friendship built entirely on having survived the exact same particular kind of quiet, persistent tyranny, separated only by years and states between us. Rick, last I heard through the persistent neighborhood grapevine, moved out of state entirely for a fresh start, beginning again somewhere Diane's name carried no history, no headlines, no courtroom sentencing transcripts permanently attached to it. I think sometimes, quietly, about that very first citation, the small ceramic frog, how something so genuinely small became the opening thread of an entire year's slow unraveling, and how close I actually came to simply paying it quietly. If I had just paid that original $40 fine and stayed completely quiet, Diane likely would have kept right on exploiting this entire neighborhood for years to come, exactly the way she had clearly gotten away with in Georgia before. Instead, my simple refusal to quietly comply became the small, stubborn beginning of something much larger entirely, genuine accountability, real community, and a truly fair place to finally raise my kids in real peace at last. These days, our Saturday pool afternoons look exactly like they genuinely should. Emma and Jake happily splashing, Priya's kids racing eagerly for the pool floats, laughter echoing warmly off a fence that finally, truly belongs only to us now. The automatic gate still locks exactly the same reliable way it always did. A safety feature nobody but Diane ever managed to twist into pure chaos. Now simply protecting my family the way I had always genuinely intended it to. Sometimes the biggest fights of our lives start over the very smallest things imaginable. A small garden gnome, pool fence, a woman who mistook simple kindness for weakness one time too many for her own good. And sometimes, the very same system originally built to control you becomes the exact thing that finally, completely, locks the truth firmly in place for absolutely everyone to see clearly at last. The END.